Without objection. Is there any further discussion of the amendment? The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I thank the chairman. You know, the gentleman talked about stonewalling. I want to read him a quote. Quote, finally, allegations of obstruction ignore historic questions of privilege, ongoing litigation on the matter, and the fact that many executive branch witnesses testified. Democrats cannot complain about lack of participation when they created an environment that made testifying untenable. The American people will have the opportunity to decide in November 2020. We should let them, end quote. I suspect the gentleman recognizes that quote. Those are his words when he voted against impeachment of President Trump in 2019. So let's not pretend that this is not anything but the farce that it is. I understand the gentleman's position regarding President Biden, but the notion that this has any semblance of credibility or legitimacy is bellied by the facts. And while I would hope that my colleagues would apply some coherent consistency with respect to their views on impeachment, I'm not expecting that. But one thing that I certainly don't believe the American people can countenance is the notion that somehow this process is a fair one, or a transparent one, or an open one, or a necessary one. And that I would yield to my colleague from New Mexico.
Thank you very much. And I think that in response to this, the very fact that there is an indictment of Hunter Biden shows that President Biden and President Biden's Department of Justice stood back. And I think it's important to actually remember that Attorney General Garland recently reiterated his basic truth about this case. And he said, I promised the Senate when I came before it for confirmation that I would leave Mr. Rice in place and that I would not interfere with his investigation. And I have kept that promise. He also testified that there had been no contact with the president or the White House about the Hunter Biden matter. So all that you are doing over there of saying something has happened with Hunter Biden and we must raise it, and we must have more and more and more documents. Oh my God, almost 100,000 pages of documents already, and you can't find a link? Because we need to remember that this is about whether or not President Biden has done anything in the last 3 years. It's not about his son's action. Just as the impeachments of President Trump were about his conduct, and they weren't about how his kids or his son-in-law profited greatly from his presidency. They weren't about that $2 billion deal. They weren't about the money that those kids stole from a cancer charity. They were about what did President Trump do in office, not about his kid. And so this actually just proves the fact. So with that, I'll yield back to my colleague.
And I would echo my colleague's remarks and would yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
The other thing that troubles me about this is that our colleague across the aisle has said that this has to happen because there's stonewalling. Stonewalling despite the tens of thousands of pages of evidence, the testimony by private individuals, et cetera. But he's ignoring the fact that this claim that these IRS folks have disclosed misconduct has been debunked by their own witnesses, by people from the U.S. Attorney's Office, by people from the Department of Justice, by people from the FBI, by agents from the IRS. They've said these people were wrong. Yet our colleagues across the aisle cling to this misdirection and are using it to argue to their colleagues, oh, don't worry about it. This is just an inquiry. That's crap. I mean, they have been given access to the evidence. They've been given unprecedented access to the evidence. Their own witnesses, their own documents have debunked the things that they are holding out there as evidence of some fictitious misconduct. So I yield back.
And I yield back.
Is there any further comment or discussion of the amendment? A gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. You know, I think we just have to level set here. We got to remember that we're here dealing with an inquiry. This has nothing to do with the former president. This has nothing to do with articles of impeachment. This resolution establishes nothing more than a process to follow the evidence and assert our Article 1 authorities. By the way, Article 1 authorities that Nancy Pelosi greatly reduced. But again, any talk that is outside of the process, outside of producing witnesses, outside of compelling compliance with subpoenas, for example, is irrelevant to the discussion. We're here simply talking about moving forward with the process. With that, I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the questions on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote's been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess.
Burgess votes no.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. No. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey, no. Mr. Norman. No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy. No. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin. No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy. No. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. McGovern. Aye. Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse. Aye. Mr. Neguse, aye. Ms. Leisure Fernandez. Aye. Ms. Leisure Fernandez, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to it. Are there additional amendments?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment number 3 to House Resolution 918, offered by Ms. Scanlon. Before the resolve clause, insert the following. Whereas, in their investigation, the Republican majority has received 38,000 pages of financial records, including bank records for the personal accounts of members of the president's family and other private citizens, over 2,000 pages of Treasury Department reports, and tens of thousands of pages of records and emails from the National Archives from President Biden's service as vice president. Whereas Hunter Biden has offered to testify publicly under oath as part of the investigation. Whereas House committees have heard dozens of hours of testimony from Hunter Biden's business partners and then Vice President Biden's financial advisor, 3 current U.S. attorneys and Department of Justice officials, and 4 current Federal Bureau of Investigation and Internal Revenue Service supervisory special agents, and unprecedented testimony from Special Counsel David Weiss on an ongoing investigation. Whereas the FBI and Treasury Department have provided access to and briefings on highly sensitive law enforcement documents. Whereas the National Archives have produced 62,000 additional pages of then Vice President Biden's records this week, and in addition to the 20,000 pages already publicly available. And whereas at the end of June, Committee on Oversight and Accountability Chairman James Comer said in an interview, "Every subpoena that I have signed as chairman of the House Oversight Committee over the last 5 months, we have gotten 100% of what we requested, whether it's with the FBI or with the banks or with Treasury. Now, therefore be it."
Gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the stated purpose of launching this inquiry is the false claim that President Biden has stonewalled this sham investigation, the purpose of this amendment is to detail the unprecedented and extensive cooperation provided by the president, his family, and this administration, despite the absence of any constitutional basis for this sham political stunt. I want to remind everyone again what's really going on here. It's as simple as this. House Republicans have wasted the past year on a cheap political stunt. The people who send us to Washington do so with the belief that we will work to make their and their families' lives better. But as we've seen all year, the extremists who have put the House majority into a chokehold aren't interested in keeping up their end of the bargain. And now they've brought us here today to waste more of the American public's time and tax dollars on petty political vengeance. In case it isn't clear already, constitutional scholars are not driving this impeachment inquiry. Instead, the former president's lackeys here in Congress are running the show, holding the floor hostage as they attempt to curry favor to obtain pardons or positions in a second Trump administration. Meanwhile, the rest of their conference seems content to sleepwalk into dictatorship as they yield what remains of their consciences to the most extreme members of the Republican Party. My amendment would shine some light on this shameful process and expose it for what it really is, a circus and a farce cooked up to placate the disgraced, defeated, and twice impeached former president. You know, there's a term for what House Republicans have proposed with their resolution today to start an impeachment inquiry. It's called a kangaroo court, a court in which the principles of law and justice are disregarded or perverted to reach a predetermined conclusion. This is my favorite definition: a mob-operated tribunal that disregards or parodies existing principles of law. That's what we're dealing with here, a MAGA kangaroo court, engaged in a desperate search for evidence to prop up a predetermined conclusion, and in which they're willing to subvert both the truth and the Constitution in a naked political stunt. For the past year, President Biden and his administration and his family members, private citizens with no role in the government, unlike the former guy, they have shared tens of thousands of documents with this kangaroo inquisition, including emails, financial records, and Treasury Department reports. They've responded to extreme Republican requests, no matter how absurd. Chairman Comer of the Oversight Committee has admitted this himself, saying, every subpoena that I have signed over the last 5 months, we've gotten 100% of what we requested. Numerous individuals, including private citizens, U.S. attorneys, Department of Justice officials, a special counsel overseeing an ongoing investigation, and federal law enforcement agents have made themselves available for dozens of hours of testimony and interviews. Federal law enforcement officials have provided briefings and access to highly sensitive documents. The president's son has offered to testify publicly under oath in front of Congress and the country, an offer that the Republicans have rejected. Extreme Republicans will continue trying to muddy the waters, attempting to drag the president and the American people down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and untruths to support their MAGA kangaroo court. But the public knows this is a sham. The fact is that Chairman Comer and the rest of the so-called investigators have seen everything. Their fundamental problem isn't a lack of evidence. They have mountains of evidence. Their problem is that none of it proves their baseless accusations, and they know it. They can't even look at us. Dozens and dozens of Republican members and even Fox News hosts have admitted on the record there's no evidence, and they know it. But instead of admitting that, Republican leadership has yielded to the blackmail of the MAGA mob and agreed to spend our last legislative days of the year wasting more time to prop up a floundering, dead-end investigation. And in doing so, they further their attempts to chip away at the legitimacy and core values of our country's institutions. The American people deserve better than this. I encourage all of my colleagues to support my amendment to shine transparency and truth onto this extreme, illegitimate stunt. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion or debate on the amendment? Gentleman from
I'll
Pennsylvania.
yield to the ranking member. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. So again, I got a level set here. We got to remember that these documents that my colleagues are talking about that were produced, these weren't just freely given documents by the good graces of the Biden administration, or the Biden family, rather. Those were given to the House by whistleblowers. Whistleblowers, I might add, that had been vilified by the far left Democratic extremists. In the bank records, these bank records weren't freely given by the Biden administration. They weren't even freely given by the banks. The banks received subpoenas, and that compelled the production of the bank records. So if again, we're talking about a process here. There should be, if there's nothing to hide, why not just go through the process? Why not just have this so we can compel the production of documents, so we can compel the testimony of witnesses and force some depositions? If there's nothing to hide, there should be no issue with following the process. So again, I want to level set and just set the stage for why we need these documents. And again, what we have received has not been freely given. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion or debate? Ranking member.
First, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record two different letters, one from the Trump White House and one from the Biden White House. You know, we hear a lot about stonewalling. I mean, the cooperation has really been unprecedented. But let me just read one excerpt from this was in response to the inquiry regarding President Trump. The White House's response to Congress was, given that your inquiry lacks any legitimate constitutional foundation, any pretense of fairness, or even the most elementary due process protections, the executive branch cannot be expected to participate in it. Consistent with the duties of the President of the United States, and in particular, his obligation to preserve the rights of future occupants of his office, President Trump cannot permit his administration to participate in this partisan inquiry under any circumstances. Now, we're going to contrast that with the response that Mr. Comer and Mr. Jordan received from this White House, again, basically saying we believe in engaging in good faith is critical to avoid constitutional conflict, and we propose a meeting with your staff to start this important process. Given the compressed timeline created by your waiting nearly 3 weeks to respond to our prior letter, we expect that you will put down the return date for your subpoena to allow accommodations process to proceed. Basically, it's a tale of two approaches. One administration that wants to stonewall, that was Trump, and then this administration that has cooperated.
Without objection.
But I just want to close with this. This is breaking news for everybody. So our Republican colleague, Don Bacon, just a few minutes ago told a small group of reporters this morning that there are, quote, probably not high crimes or misdemeanors that Joe Biden has committed. Yet he still plans to vote to authorize this impeachment inquiry, notwithstanding that there's no there there. I guess the question is, when are people going to stand up and end this extreme political stunt? This is not the beginning of something. This should be the end of something. You've been doing this for over a year, and there's nothing there. There's no smoke. And so this is a colossal waste of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion or debate on the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Just in response to the idea that this is about creating a process, I just want to reiterate what both the ranking member has said, what Representative Scanlon has laid out in detail. A process has been ongoing. Subpoenas were issued. Subpoenas were responded to. Documents were provided. They were provided in many different ways. And that is indeed a process. There is no evidence of anything but that, as pointed out earlier, President Biden's a good father. President Biden fought corruption. President Biden was not involved in Joe or Hunter Biden's business dealings. That's what the documents have proven. What this process is keeping this story alive, is keeping Congress involved and distracted by this impeachment idea, conspiracy thought process, because it's like coming from above because there is no documents. We already have a process that we followed. And the idea that this is just about a process, we need to look at Newsmax. Chairman Comer actually said, I'd indict tomorrow before they even began this process. They were talking about impeaching. They were not waiting for a process. And Mr. Chair, I would yield to my colleague.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. And I couldn't agree more. Again, perhaps the most frustrating element of this exercise is the intellectual dishonesty to pretend that this is anything but a fait accompli. There isn't a single one of you who's going to vote against impeachment if articles are brought to the floor 4 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, 12 weeks from now. So pretending as though this is just somehow a very simple step forward to approve a perfunctory or cursory process is not level setting with the American people. It is one of the most solemn votes that any of you will take in your careers. I suspect none of you have voted in the past to initiate an impeachment inquiry. So treating it in this cursory way, as the gentleman from Pennsylvania apparently wants the American people to believe, as I said, is inconsistent with the constitutional nature of impeachment, the weightiness of impeachment and proceeding on this course. And I would hope it would give some of you some pause. It's clear that that hasn't been the case. I yield back to the gentleman.
And thank you. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion or debate on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I would yield to my colleague from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman's recognized.
I'd like to thank my good friend. Again, just a level set, we're here talking about a process. And it's one thing to cherry pick lines from either this White House or the last administration. But at the end of the day, we're here protecting our Article 1 authority. And we're here largely because the Biden administration lawyers are saying they don't have to face the subpoenas. They don't have to compel this evidence because we haven't had this vote. So they're the ones that are saying we don't have to be here. We are trying to set this up so that we can get all the evidence and have this. But again, this is about the process, and this is about, absolutely.
The gentleman served with me on the Judiciary Committee 4 years ago in 2019. Right?
I'm sorry.
President Trump demanded that Don McGahn not testify in the Judiciary Committee, that not a single document be produced by the White House, that not a single executive branch employee be allowed to testify in front of the United States Congress. I didn't hear much about Article 1 authorities from you or any of my colleagues in the Judiciary Committee. You were there with me.
Yeah, and I yielded time that wasn't mine.
Sure.
So I apologize to my colleague. Here's the thing, that once the rules have been changed, the rules are changed. So now you can't say that what was good enough for President Trump is no longer good enough for President Biden. So the Democrats shifted the standard. Frankly, now impeachment, you could view it as almost a political exercise. We're moving forward. Anytime you have a president of a different party than the House, there's going to be calls from whatever base it is, whether it's Democratic base or Republican base, because of that. But that's not the Republican standard. That was the standard that was set by the Democrats in the last administration twice. But again, this is about our Article 1 authority. This is about making sure that we have this vote because the Biden administration is saying they don't have to produce the documents or compel witnesses to testify in depositions because we haven't had this vote. And with that, the gentlelady has been very generous with her time. I yield back.